Hello and welcome to ThePrint. A few days ago, the Indian Meteorological Department released a presser on the warm winters that we have experienced in 2024 and how that has been a trend that's been continuing since the past 2 years. It also spoke about the likelihood of more heat waves in the summer of 2024. On the other hand, the Karnataka government today issued an advisory for heat waves as temperatures in Bengaluru reached over 35 degrees Celsius. Heat waves are a growing public health concern, and to understand how we can combat them effectively, we have with us here today Aditya Valiathan Pillai, who is a fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. Aditya works on climate change adaptation and resilience with a focus on how we can build institutions. He was previously a fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Welcome, Aditya. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you.
So let's just jump right in. And I'd like to start, as I mentioned, the IMD's report, it spoke about sort of the receding effects of El Nino, which is one of the reasons why we're experiencing much warmer winters. There's also been a report by the Center for Science and Environment that came out last week, which showed us that India experienced a total of more than 300 heat wave days in the past 2 years. So we can essentially see that as climate change and global warming increases, we are going to face more heat waves. And let's just start with, why are heat waves a public policy concern?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, Akanksha. I mean, the trend lines are all very clear. The number of heat wave days are increasing. The intensity of heat waves is increasing. We've already seen heat waves in India that have killed many hundreds of people. And that is more and more going to be what the future looks like. And the reason this is important is because A, it's a pan-India phenomenon. Every place will be affected by increasing heat, but affected differently. And there are many different systems and sectors that are going to be impacted, right? So a couple of years ago, we saw that agriculture was impacted when India's wheat exports were curtailed because of heat, early heat. It'll affect things like the railways, the power grid, the health system, the water sector. So it is pan-India, it is multi-sectoral. Every state will have to deal with a different basket of problems, which is why heat is a problem for pretty much everybody to think about. And it requires governance responses from every single layer of government, right? So your panchayat and your urban local body, your municipal commissioners, the mayors, the district collectors, but also state governments. The fact is, there's a certain point beyond which the human body and the various social and economic systems we've built cannot function the way it has in the past if heat goes beyond a certain point, right? You're going to see people being able to work less, their health being affected even more than it already is in extremely hot summers that we've had already. And it's going to affect all sorts of different aspects of people's lives, right? If kids can't go out and play because it's a heat wave, then what does that mean for their development? It affects everybody in deeply personal ways.
So Aditya, you've also analyzed the heat action plans of different cities, states and districts, and you've also been to the recently concluded National Disaster Management Authority's workshop on heat waves. So first, can you tell us a little bit more about what heat action plans essentially are? Yeah. And also, in your work with them, in your work with the different institutes of the Indian government, what level of preparedness are we at? What are our thrust areas? What are the areas that we should be focusing on even more to tackle heat waves?
Yeah, heat action plans are fairly interesting things, right? So I see it at least as a sort of bottom-up, very organic response from different cities and states and districts, aided by various technical institutions that bring the kind of technical know-how, figuring out how do we respond to this challenge of heat waves, right? And what these heat action plans do is not simple, right? So they basically lay out at one level a standard operating procedure for different sectors, what they should do during a heat wave, before a heat wave, after a heat wave, right? So it just sort of codifies that, so there's some level of systematization across government. Otherwise, heat waves are quite confusing as disasters, right? It's not like a hurricane or a cyclone that comes and hits a particular part of the coast and then you see infrastructure damage and there's loss of life. It is invisible. and it just affects all sorts of different systems in weird ways, right? So your viewers in Delhi might be familiar with the experience of something in the house catching fire at the end of May. Because the temperatures are 50 degrees plus, you have massive load going through your electricity wires because the air conditioners are on. Everything from that to a crop failure to water shortages in dams, all of these things are happening, right? Forest fires kick off in different places, droughts could happen. So that is the level of sort of cross-sectoral response that's required in this, and that's what heat action plans do. And so the second thing heat action plans do is they try and figure out where exactly the vulnerable points are in society, right? Who is it that's most vulnerable? Where are they located? Which sector is most likely to find itself vulnerable during a heat wave? And then the third thing they do, and they should do, is the heat action plan should also be offering a path forward on how we can live as a society that is growing and thriving, but in a much, much hotter world. And that is actually, to my mind, the most important aspect of what a heat action plan does, right? And just to sort of come to the second part of your question about where are we right now and what needs to be done, right? The most encouraging fact is there is an understanding within the system, like I said, that heat is a problem. There are heat action plans everywhere. But now we really need to get down to the nuts and bolts of making sure they are implemented. And that is now the gap. So we have the heat action plans. We need to make sure they're implemented. What do we need for that? We need money, right? Financing is a big issue because most of these heat action plans are not financed. Is it that there is no money in the system and this will never be funded? I don't think so. Precisely because India has a very wide range of social policies and welfare schemes that have a bearing on heat outcomes, right? Let me give you an example. There are centrally sponsored schemes in the water sector. There is the Smart Cities Mission. There is something called the Nagar One Yojana that is about urban shade. All of these things, with a little bit of tweaking at the 1 to 2% level, can be made to improve heat resilience, right? And we have 4.76 lakh crores locked away in centrally sponsored schemes, and a large chunk of them, Manrega, for example, also another where you can build ponds and talabs and all that sort of thing. So you can think about many, many different ways in which this can go. The second thing that really needs to happen is heat action plans aren't adequately localized, right? Because it's first generation, what we have at the moment is a bunch of heat action plans that look and feel and sound like each other, right? But like I was saying earlier, the type of heat is very different. My parents live in coastal Karnataka. The heat there is incredibly humid, right? The wind factors there are very different. How much does a cool roof work there versus a place like in Delhi where the heat is directly, there's not a lot of humid heat and the sun shines directly on top of the roof. How do cool roofs work in all sorts of different places across the country, right? So we really need to figure out the localization element of these heat action plans.
Apart from these heat action plans, which as you described serve as sort of a regulatory framework which offers governments of cities and districts sort of a path on how, if ever they were to act on heat, this is how you're supposed to do it. But in terms of already implemented policies or other plans or certain laws, is there anything that districts or states or cities are currently doing, already doing to combat heat?
Overall, macro, India is doing pretty well on this front, right? So in the sense that the fact that there are all of these heat action plans, the fact that heat is recognized as an issue, we should be very cognizant as we have this conversation internally in India that this is something that will set a template for countries in Africa, for countries in Southeast Asia, where the conversation is just about picking up and will become incredibly important in the coming decades, right? So India, as this country that's sort of experimenting first, will set a template for everybody else. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we think about heat as a policy measure.
That actually, that makes a lot of sense. And just building off of that, since you started off about the regulatory framework, that heat action plans aren't exactly. And we have been discussing a lot about heat and dealing with heat waves as a policy measure, but there's also, as you said, heat pervades almost every aspect of society. And can it entirely be just the government's job to deal with it effectively? What about industries? What about other sections of society? How do they come in? Because as you said, it's a public health concern, and that isn't restricted just to the government. It's restricted to everywhere else. So where do other interventions come in?
No, that's a great question. I'm glad you touched upon that, Akanksha, because there is, I think, a sense that this requires a state-first response, and that's understandable because it's a new thing and it's also highly technical and so on and so forth. But the scale of the problem is so massive, and it's just going to get worse and worse into the future, right? It's not a problem that is static. And it's just expanding in scope and in depth of complexity. It really requires every sector of society to figure out what their adaptation strategy to this is, right? Firstly, facts are facts. We don't fully understand heat as a problem, right? And we don't understand heat as a problem for very many reasons, right? How does it affect different vulnerable groups? What does it change about the economy? So when a heat wave happens, how much economic damage takes place, right? How do we figure out exactly where the most vulnerable people are? What solutions work in different type of heat contexts, right? So earlier I was talking about humid heat, and then you have dry heat, but heat in the mountains is a problem, right? You have a heat wave. It could well affect agricultural production that is dependent on slightly cooler temperatures in the mountains, which very large chunks of the mountain population depend on. So that is a totally different set of problems that need to be dealt with different solutions, and they need to be tailored to that place. That requires research, right? The example I love going to is how thick should your leaves be over a street or a road where you're trying to build urban shade cover, right? That depends on the strength of the sunlight. So you have to choose your species of tree correctly. How many years does it take for that tree to grow, right? When it is fully grown, what is the heat going to be, right? Is it the right solution for that future heat? We have to understand the solutions much better. And that requires massive amounts of research coordination. How do we imagine the future of the Indian city without private capital having understood that heat is going to be a long-term threat, right? Because they are the ones investing in building Indian cities. You need them to sort of think about it when they're building their buildings, when they're setting up their offices, when they are setting up their industrial lines. They have to think about these things. And equally, there's a whole bunch of areas where collaborations between the private sector, the state, and research organizations is necessary. What is the future of cooling, right? There is no doubt to my mind that the future of Indian heat adaptation is going to be mainly a cooling story, because that's the rate of air conditioning growth in this country, right? India is now very quickly bouncing into middle class, into a larger middle class and a middle income country, and AC growth is quite exponential. But how do you think about energy efficiency in an AC so that we don't blow our carbon budget, right? How do you make sure that Indian energy demand doesn't go up so much that we aren't able to cool the country? So what is the future of air conditioning? Now that is something the private sector definitely needs to get involved in. They probably are best placed because they're most likely to invest in this stuff. So it really has to be pretty widespread. The final thing I want to talk about is maybe the most important, is that this idea that heat today is different from heat in the past is something that really needs to get into every section of society, because no amount of state response, private sector investment, research can get beyond the fact that you and I and everybody else need to know that there is a heat wave, that this is what heat does. I need to listen to myself, that I'm feeling exhausted, that something feels off, go in, get into a cool space, drink more water, right? That actually, it sounds super simple, but it actually might be the most effective way of handling this, right? And so that requires a lot of communication, and that requires cutting edge communication. You can't just have, a very dense sort of information dense pamphlet that is handed out. The way they did it in Bangladesh for the cyclones was just a person on a cycle with a megaphone just riding through the town saying, listen, this is a problem, move here, go here quickly, and they save thousands and thousands of lives. So it's not just about high technology or cooling and so on and so forth. It is actually about making sure that it is a community
and it's on the ground.
And it's on the ground, yeah.
That actually brings me to my next question, which is moving beyond policy, moving also beyond industry, sort of from looking at it from a bottom-up approach, which is how do you tell people that heat is a problem, and it's a problem that's very much linked to climate change?
A couple of things. Firstly, I think it's been quite heartening to see the sort of media response to heat as a problem in the last 3 or 4 years. I think it's really captured global attention. And it's not just, say, big national or global publications. It's also very much because our team here, we look at the sort of media production, especially at the local level, try to understand like what the conversation is. There is a lot of local curiosity about it, reporting on it, and it has, I think, changed in the recent past, right? So that I think is a very important thing because it's setting some sort of consciousness about what heat is as a problem. Using this line that it will eventually come for everybody, the heat, right? And so at that point, we will be forced to recognize, especially when the headlines are going on about a massive heat wave, we'll be forced to recognize that there is something fundamentally different. I would actually argue, and this is totally based on anecdotal evidence, based on fieldwork, but also talking to people in different parts of society, that local recognition of climate change is quite high, but it's not in the technical, formal way that you and I talk about climate change. It is in the sense that there is something radically different, right? My crops aren't growing the same way. We've had to substitute crops out. And if you go to a place like Uttarakhand, for example, even in the sort of the high hills of the Himalayas, you find people sitting there and talking about how the tree line for apples has gone up and there are different types of vegetables growing there, more tropical vegetables being grown in the Himalayas and so on and so forth, right? It is very broad change and it is disrupting settled practices that are hundreds of years old. And so in that sense, the messaging about climate change, I think, is important, but it is adding a label and a name to something that people, I think, broadly recognize, right? So I don't think it's as insurmountable a task as it might first appear, because I think people get it. You need a state that is constantly able to take inputs from the ground, take inputs from science, formulate policy, fail, learn that it is failing, and correct it.
Reformulate.
Right? For that to happen, the politics has to align with it. For that to happen, you need enough scientific capacity, people willing to contribute to the process, so on and so forth, right? That's the key. And once you solve that, I actually think you might end up with a system that is better than when it started, right? And this is for every country on Earth. So it is, I think, we're entering a new phase in what it means to govern, what it means to be a state, and what it means to deal with an existential problem.
That was all we had. Thank you so much for being with us, Aditya. This is Akanksha Mishra with Surat Singh Bisht, reporting for ThePrint.